Hello everybody. I am so prepared this time because I have water in my most fancy cup. I have pineapple juice, which tastes exactly like sugar water, but pretend. And then I even have my emergency fudge. So we are so ready to get to the last chapter. And actually, I'm pretty proud of myself. I've been telling everybody I made my first eggplant parmesan, and it came out pretty good. Although the thing that I have learned is lasagna is better the day after. Eggplant parmesan is best the day of. So anyway, on to chapter 5 of The Ship Who Sang, and we are on page 172, 248. So we have almost finished a full novel on the YouTubes. The Ship Who Dissembled. Brain ships don't disappear, Helva said in what she hoped was a firm, no-argument tone. Taron stuck his chin out in a way that caused him to appear a necklace Neanderthal. This mannerism had passed from amusing through annoying to unendurable. You heard Central, Taron replied at his most didactic. They do disappear because they have disappeared. The fact of disappearance is inconsistent with shell psychology, Helva said, barely managing to restrain herself from shouting at top volume. She had the feeling that she might force him to understand by overwhelming him with sound alone. She knew this was basically illogical, but in trying to cope with Taron over the past galactic year, she found she reacted more and more on an emotional, rather than on a reasonable level. This partnership was clearly intolerable. She would even go so far as to say degrading, and she would allow it to continue no longer than it took them to finish this assignment and return to Regulus Base. Helva had had enough of Taron. She did not care two feathers in a jet vent if the conclusion wasn't mutual. It had been difficult for her to admit that she found herself in a situation she couldn't adjust to, but she and Taron were clearly incompatible. She would just have to admit to an error of judgment and correct it. It was the only reasonable course of action. Helva groaned inwardly. He was contagious. She was talking more and more as he did. Your loyalty is commendable, if in this instance misplaced, Taron was saying pompously. The facts are there. 4 brain-controlled ships engaged on Central World's commissions have disappeared without trace. Their accompanying pilots with them. Fact. A ship can alter its tape. A pilot cannot. Fact. The ships have failed to appear at a scheduled port of call. Fact. The ships have failed to appear in the adjacent sectors of space nearest their previous or projected ports of call. Therefore, they have disappeared. The ships must have altered the projected journey for no known reason. Therefore, the ships are unreliable organisms. This conclusion follows the presented data and is unalterable. Any rational intelligence must admit the validity of that conclusion. He gave her that irritating smirk that she had originally thought a sweet smile. Helva counted slowly to 1,000 by tens. When she spoke again, her voice was under perfect control. The presented data is incomplete. It lacks motivation. There is no reason for those 4 ships to have disappeared for their own purposes. They weren't even badly indebted. Indeed, the Delta Romeo was within 3 standard years of solvency. Just as I am, she thought. Therefore, and on the basis of privileged information available to me, she came as close as makes no never mind to spitting out the pronoun. Your conclusion is unacceptable. I cannot see what privileged information, if you actually have any, Taron awarded her a patronizing smile, could change my conclusion since Central has also reached it. There, she thought to herself, he had managed to drag in old infallible authority, and that is supposed to stop me in my tapes. It was useless to argue with him anyway. He was, as Niall Paralon had once accused her of being, stubborn for the wrong reasons. He was also pig-headed, dogmatic, insensitive, regulation-hedged, and so narrowly oriented as to prevent any vestige of imagination or intuitive thinking from coloring his mental processes for a microsecond. She oughtn't have thought of Niall Parlon. It did her temper no good. That officious little pipsqueak had paid her another of his unsolicited, unofficial visits to argue her out of choosing the Actheonite. He passed his brawn training on theory credits. He's been slated for garbage runs, not you, Niall Parlon had cried, pacing her main cabin. And you are not the person who will be his partner. His profile tape looks extremely compatible to me. Use your wits, girl. Just look at him. He's all muscle and no heart. Perfectly good looking to be credible. Christ, he's an android complete with metal brainworks programmed in a rarefied atmosphere. He'll drive you batty. He's a reliable, well-balanced, well-read, well-adjusted, and you spiteful, tin-plated virgin, said Parlon, and for the second time in their acquaintance, he charged out of her cabin without a backward look. Now Helva had to admit Niall Parlon had been demoralizingly accurate about Bron Terran of Acteon. The only kind thing that could be said about Terran, in Helva's estimation, was that he was a complete change from any other partner she'd had, temporarily or permanently. And if he called her an unreliable organism once more, she would blow him out the airlock. However, Terran considered he had silenced her with the last telling remark. He had seated himself at his pilot control board, flexed his fingers as he always did, and then ran his precious and omnipotent data through the computer, checking their journey tape. It was obvious he was out to thwart any irrational desire Helva might have to change their journey and make them disappear. Terran worked methodically and slowly, his broad brow unwrinkled, his wide-cheeked face serene, his brown eyes never straying from the task at hand. How, under the suns of heaven, did I ever have the incredible lack of insight to pick him? Helva wondered, the adrenaline level in her shell still high. I must have been out of my ever-loving, encapsulated mind. Maybe my nutrient fluid is going acid. When I get back to Regulus, I'm going to demand an endocrine check. Something is wrong with me. No. Helva contradicted herself. There is nothing wrong with me that getting rid of Terran won't cure. He's got me doubting my sanity, and I know I'm sane, or I wouldn't be this ship. For the record, my beloved, don't stick with people who make you think like that. It's not healthy. Trust me, I know. Remember that, Helva, she told herself. It's quite possible that, before this trip ends, he'll have persuaded you're a menace to Central World's autonomy because your intelligence is so unreliable the safest thing for the known world is for you to opt out. Him and his assumption that a brain chip must be an unreliable organism because they, she, he never say it, please. Could digest data, ignore the irrelevant, and proceed on seemingly illogical courses to logical and highly successful ends. Such as the tangle she and Kira had got into on Alioth. And, to quote the particulars, she, Helva, had already been unreliable several times in her short career as a brain chip. Terran had been kind enough to point out those deviations to her, as well as a far more logical course of action under all the same conditions, and he had admonished her never to act outside cut orders while he, Terran of Acteon, was her brawn partner. She was to do nothing, repeat, nothing, without clearing first with him and then with Central. An intelligent organism was known by its ability to follow orders without deviation. And you actually mean, Helva had remarked, laughingly the first time Terran had made this solemn pronouncement. She had still had her sense of humor in those days. That if our orders require me to enter an atmosphere my subsequent investigations proved was corrosive to my hull and would result in our deaths, I should follow such orders, to the death, that is. Irresponsible orders are not given by Central World ships. Terran replied reprovingly. Half a league onward. I do not understand what half-leagues have to do with the principle under discussion, he said coldly. I was trying to make a subtle point. I will rephrase. In a concise and therefore comprehensible manner, if you please. Orders can be cut without foreknowledge of unavailable but highly relevant facts, such as the before-mentioned corrosive atmospheres. Hypothetical, but valid as a case in point. We do, you must admit, often approach relatively unexplored star systems. Therefore, it is entirely possible, not merely hypothetical, that pre-cut orders can require an intelligent and mature re-evaluation, which may require what appears to be insubordinate alteration of those same orders, and or rank disobedience of those before-mentioned orders. Terran had shaken his head, not sadly, because Helva was certain he had experienced no deep human emotions in his life, but rather reprovingly. I know now why Central Worlds insists on a human pilot as commander of the brain-controlled ships. They are necessary, so necessary when an unreliable organism is nominally in control of so powerful an instrument as this ship. Helva had sputtered in astonishment at this misconception. She had been about to point out that the pilot control on board did not override her. She had override on the pilot. There will come a day, Terran had continued inexorably, when such poor expedients are no longer necessary. Automatic operations will be perfected to such a fine degree human brains will no longer be required. They use human beings, Helva had replied, pronouncing each syllable distinctly. Ah, yes, human beings, fallible creatures at best. We are subject to so many pressures, so frail a bark, so great a task. Terran tended to go in for homiletics at the drop of a gauge. To err is human, and to forgive is divine, he sighed. And when this human element, so prone to error, is eliminated, when automation is perfected, there, Helva, is the operative word, when it is perfected, there will be no more need for such stopgap techniques as the Central Worlds must presently employ. When that perfection is achieved, ships will truly be reliable. He patted the computer console patronizingly. Helva had stifled a monosyllabic comment. Historical and incontrovertible arguments welled up from her schooling and conditioning years. These were based, she abruptly realized, on incidents that were unfortunately tended to support his peculiar theory of unreliability, however sane the outcome. In each instance, the brain ships had acted by ignoring or revising previous orders, as the unusual circumstances they encountered required them to do. By Terran's unswerving logic, intelligence itself, whether shell or mobile, is unreliable. Helva could not see him ever admitting that intelligent conclusions are not always logical. And right now, every scrap of intelligence, instinct, training, conditioning, and reason told Helva that brain ships do not just disappear. Not 4 in a row, not 4 in a row, not 4 less than a regular month. 1 in 100 years, yes, that was possible, logical, and probable. But there was always some hint, some deductible reason, like the 732, psychotic with grief over Alioth. Why had she allowed Kira to leave her when that assignment was over? Kira would have been quite of Helva's mind in this matter. But Helva did not see the faintest hope in convincing Terran that multiple disappearances were so preposterous, because it involved some intuition, of which Terran had none. How had this didactism of his escape psych probe? And another thing she had noticed about him, whether he would ever admit it consciously or not, the very concept of cyborgs like Helva was repugnant to Terran. Braun was very much aware, if the majority of Central World's population were not, that behind the ship's titanium bulkhead reposed a shell containing an inert, but complete human body. If only Terran weren't so thoroughly irritating, she could almost feel sorry for him. And, before he had antagonized her, She had actually understood his drive to perfection that motivated every thought and action. Terran was psychotically afraid of error, of making any mistake because mistake implied failure, and failure was inadmissible. If he made no mistakes, he would never be guilty of failure and would be a success. Well, Helva mused, I'm not afraid of making a mistake, and I'm not afraid of admitting failure, and I sure made one with Terran. When he starts mistrusting shell people, he is not good to me or Central Worlds. Well, I won't be vindictive. I'll request a change and take the fine. It won't set me too far back in the red. And with a new partner and a couple of good assignments, I'll still pay off. But Terran goes off my deck. The decision of divorce, now subvocalized, made her feel much better. When Terran awoke the next day, he checked, as he always did, every single gauge, dial, and meter, forward and aft. This practice took him most of the morning. A similar rundown would have taken Helva 10 minutes on the outside. By custom, and by any other brawn, but Terran, the check was left to the brain partner. Wearily, Helva had to read back to Terran her findings, which he corroborated with his own. Ship-shape and Bristol fashion, he commented, as he always did when the results tallied. As they always did. Then he seated himself at the pilot console, awaiting touchdown on Tania Borealis. As the Tango Hotel 834 had planet falls on Durrell, Tania Borealis' fourth planet before, the spaceport was familiar to Terran, familiar with and contemptuous to the point of addressing all remarks to Helva rather than to her brawn. If this complimented Helva, it made Terran harder to deal with later. He responded by being twice as officious and pompous with the port officials and the health services captain to whom their cargo of rare drugs had been assigned. A certain amount of extra precautions were required, considering the nature and potency of the drugs. But it was offensive of Terran to type beam back to Central Worlds for a replica of Captain Brandt's ID cube before turning over the invaluable packet to him. To make matters worse, Niall Paralon, being section supervisor, had to take the call, and Helva caught all the nuances in his carefully official words. Helva seethed inwardly. It would have to be Paralon. But she had the heretofore unexpected urge to burst outward from her shell in all directions. Paralon would be unbearably righteous no matter when she filed intent to change bronze. There were 3 more stops, one at Tenia Australis, and the 2 at Alula counterparts, before she would touch down at Regulus base. Better let Niall Paralon have his laugh now, so he'd be over it by the time she did ditch Terran. So, girding herself for Paralon's smugged reception, Helva flashed a private signal for him to keep the tight beam open. Yeah, that tastes dreadfully artificial. Better to have water. Terran, slave that he was to protocol, would see Captain Brandt off the ship to the waiting land car. She'd have a chance to file her intention then. Tower to Tango Hotel 834, permission to board you, requested by the Antialathon Zycon, said Durrell Tower. Permission refused, Helva said, without so much as a glance in Terran's direction. Pilot Terran speaking, the Brawn interjected forcefully, striding to the console and opening the local channel direct. What is the purpose of the request? Dunno. The gentlemen are on their way by ground car. Terran disconnected and glanced out the open airlock. Brandt's car was just passing the oncoming vehicle midfield. You have no right to issue orders independently, Helva, when the request has been properly stated. Have you ever heard of an Antialathon Zycon? Helva demanded. And isn't this a restricted mission? I am perfectly aware of the nature of this mission, and I have never heard of an Antialathon Zycon. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. And, as it sounds religious, and one of our prime service directives is to be respectful to any and all religious orders, we should receive him. True enough, but may I remind Pilot Terran that I am his senior in service by some years, and I have access to memory banks, mechanical memory banks, less prone to lapsus memoriae then the human mind, and there is no Zycon. The request was issued properly, Terran repeated. Shouldn't we consult Central first? There are some actions that are indicated without recourse to official sanction. Oh, really? The ground car had arrived, and the Zycon people had dutifully requested permission to board. Their arrival meant no chance for Helva to speak privately with Central. She was doubly infuriated by Terran's childish insistence on seeing whoever these Zycon were. She knew perfectly well if she had countermanded his order, he would have been in the right to call her down. But since he had taken the initiative, naturally, it was all in order. Yes, dear? I know, it's almost bedtime. I know. You are so patient, and you are so good, and it is a wonder that you ever get anything done with such a boob for a father. I know. Well, you lay down. I won't be long, okay? I love you, sweetheart. Yeah, I know you're super cute. Opa just had a bath, so she is very clean and soft and sweet smelling. I love you. Would you like a cookie? There's a very interested pupper. She is so full of love. Okay, I will give you a cookie. You have been very well behaved today. There you go. The four men stepped on board. Two in plain gray tunics, stepping smartly inside the lock as though the vanguard of a great dignitary. Sidearms hung from their belts, and both wore curious cylindrical whistles on neck chains. The third man, grey of hair but vigorous, obsequiously ushered in a fourth, white-haired man of imposing stature in a long grey-black robe. He fingered a whistle, larger than the guards, but similar in design, as if it were some sacred talisman. There was something not at all reassuring, Helva noted, in that obsequious performance, for the gray-haired man in the action of ushering was missing no single detail of the cabin's appointments. Just as he switched his attention to put him beside Terran, who was still at the control console, the old man reached the titanium bulkhead behind which Helva resided. The maneuvers were almost completed when something in Helva's mind went wild with alarm. "Terran, they're imposters!" she cried, remembering with sudden hope that the tight beam to Central Worlds was still open. The white-haired man lost all trace of formal dignity and, mouthing syllables in frightful cadence, stabbed a finger towards her column. Helva, in the brief moment before she lost consciousness, saw the two guards blowing on their whistles, the piercing notes sonically jamming the ship's circuitry. She saw Terran slump to the floor of the cabin, felled by the gray-haired man. Then the anesthetic gas that the old man had released into her shell overwhelmed her. "My circuits are out of order," Helva mused, and then returned to acute awareness. She saw nothing, she heard nothing, not so much as a whisper of sound, not so much as a tiny beam of light. Helva fought a primeval wave of terror that all but washed her into insanity. "I think, so I live," she told herself, with all the force of her will. "I can think, and I can remember, rationally, calmly, what has happened, what can have happened." The horror of complete isolation from sound and light was a micrometer away from utter domination of her ego. Coldly, dispassionately, Helva reviewed that final flashing scene of treachery. The entrance of the four men, the arrangement of the two guards, and their whistle ornaments. A supersonic blast, patterned to interfere with her circuitry, to paralyze her defense against the unauthorized activation of her emergency panel. The maneuvering of the third man to overpower Terran. Now, Helva continued inexorably, this attack was engineered to overcome brawn and brain simultaneously. Only someone intimately connected with the Central Worlds would have access to the information needed to vanquish both mobile and immobile units. The release syllables, and the proper pitch and cadence at which they must be spoken, were highly guarded secrets usually kept separate. For anyone to have known this information was shocking. Helva's mind leapt to an obvious but still startling conclusion. She knew now how the 4 brain chips had disappeared. They had unquestionably been shanghaied in much the same way that she had been. But why, she wondered. Where were the others? Incommunicado like herself? Or driven mad by... I refused to consider that possibility for myself or the other shell personality, Helva told herself firmly. Constructive thought, fierce concentration, will relieve the present tedium. The first ship to disappear was Foxtrot Tango 687. They had also been on a drug run, picking up raw material, though not distributing it. So had the Romeo Delta 751 and the Papa Foxtrot 699. This line of thought bore possibilities. The drugs that she had been delivering were available only through application to Central Worlds and were delivered in minute quantities by specialized teams. A 100cc ampule of mechalite could poison the water of an entire planet, rendering its population mindless slaves. A granule of the same drug diluted in a massive protein suspension base would inoculate the inhabitants of several star systems against the virulent encephalitis plagues. Tucanite, a psychedelic compound, was invaluable for psychotherapy in catatonic and autistic cases, since it heightened perceptions and awareness of the environment. The frail elders of Tucon had revived waning psychic powers with its use. Deadly as these drugs might be in one form, they were essential to millions in another and must be made available. The Damoclean sword of use and abuse forever swung perilously over the collective head of mankind. Just double checking my page count. Okay, so 14 more pages. I think I can do that. Not even a shell person was sacred from the machinations of a disturbed mind. Disturbed mind. Helva's thoughts ground down. Where was that idiot Braun of hers right now? Him and his Neanderthal attributes. His muscles would be very useful. She felt a distinct pleasure within herself as she recalled his being clouted wickedly by the third man. She hoped he was bruised, beaten, and bloodied. But at least he could see and hear without mechanical assistance. Helva felt every crevasse of her mind quivering with the effects of sense deprivation. How long could she keep her minds channeled away from? 2 households, alike in dignity. I attempt from love's fever to fly. Fly, I cannot see. Fly? The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from... No, not heaven. Portia will do me no good. The bard has played me false when I have been his sturdy advocate on other chores. In India's sunny clime, where I used to spend my time I've spent too much of, or not enough. Could it be that I am suspended midway between time and madness? There once was a bishop from Chichester, who made all the saints in their niches stir. I had a niche once, only I was moved out, not by a bishop, but a Zikon. I should sit on a Zikon, or a Fixon, or a Zikon, or a Nix, or a Sixon, or... I cannot move, I cannot see, I cannot hear. How long? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one country to dissolve the I'm dissolving, there is nothing I can think of in all of space and time that does not bring me back to sound. A scraping metallic sound, but a sound upon her aural circuits, like a hot iron in her brain, a fiery brand of sanity after the dense, thick, solid, infinite inquiet of soundlessness. She screamed, but having no connections except the aural, screamed soundlessly. Something was thundering. I have reconnected your sound system. Would you like to sit on the porch while you wait? Go ahead. You can go ahead and wait out. Maybe. Helva toned the volume rapidly down to an acceptable level. The voice was harsh, whining, nasal, unpleasant, but the sense divinely welcome. You have been disconnected from your ship function. The words made no immediate sense. She was listening to the glory of sound, and the sensation of noise was an unbelievable agony. It took a moment for those syllables to reform themselves into comprehensive tones. You have been connected to a limited audiovisual circuit to permit you to retain your sanity. Any abuse of this courtesy will result in further... A nasty laugh accompanied the threat, if not permanent deprivation. Unexpectedly, sight returned. In an evil benison, because of the object in her lens, she could not suppress the scream. "Is this your idea of cooperation?" demanded the strident voice, and a huge cavern, spiked with great ivory tusks, opened directly in front of her. Ah! Oh. Ah! She adjusted vision hastily, putting the face into normal proportions. It was not a pleasant face, even at the proper size. It belonged to the man, no longer disguised as old, who had styled himself the Antilothan of Zycon. "Cooperation?" Helva asked, confused. "Yes, your cooperation or nothing." "Yes, your cooperation or nothing." And the Zycon moved his hand to one side of her limited vision, wrapping his fingers around her input leads. "No, I'll go mad!" Helva cried, alarmed and frightened. "Mad?" And her tormentor laughed obscenely. "You've plenty of company, but shan't go mad, not yet. I have a use for you." A finger dominated her lens like a suspended projectile. No, fool, not like that!" Oh. Her captor shrieked and dashed off to one side of her screen. Desperately assembling her wits, Helva tuned up her hearing, sharpening her sight focus. She was facing a small audiovisual amplification panel into which the leads and those of ES, she could count 12 other input lines, were plugged. She had only one line of vision, straight ahead. Directly in front of her, before the panel, were two shells, trailing fine wires like fairy hair from their blunt tops. Within those shells existed two of her peers. There should be two more. Beside me. She had peripheral glimpse of more wires. Yes, beside me. Carefully, she drew against the power in the amplifier. A very limited capacity. To her left, whence the Zycon thing had gone, was the beginning of a complex interstellar communications unit from the look of it, and the few dial readings she could see. Zycon returned, smiling, a mocking, smug smile at her. "So, you are the ship who sings, the Helva obscenity. May I present your fellow obscenities? Of course, Foro's company is limited to groans and howls. We kept him in the dark too long." And the Zycon howled with pure spite. "Delia's not much better, true, but she will speak if spoken to. Taggy and Merle have learned not to talk unless I address them. So shall you, for I have always wanted my own zoo of obscenities, and I have them all in you. And you, my latest guest, will cheer my leisure hours with your incomparable voice, will you not?" Helva said nothing. She was instantly plunged into utter dark, utter soundlessness. "He's mad himself. He's doing this to terrify me. I refuse to be terrified by a madman. I will wait. I will be calm. He has a use for me, so he will not wait too long before giving me sight and sound again, or he will defeat his purpose. I will wait. I will be calm. I will soon have sight and sound again. I will wait. I will be calm. But soon, oh soon." "There now, my pretty awful. You've had time to reconsider my generosity." Helva had indeed. She limited her capitulation to a monosyllable. The blessedness of sight and sound could not quite erase the endless hours of deprivation, yet she knew from the chronometer on the panel board that he had shut her off for a scant few minutes. It was frightening to be dependent on this vile beast. She refined her vision, scanning his eyes closely. There was a faint but unmistakable tinge of blue to his skin tone that tagged him as either a native of Ro-Pupa's 3 habitable worlds, or as a Tucanite addict. The latter seemed far more likely. Well, she had been carrying Tucanite, and she knew the Romeo Delta had also. "Feel like singing now?" His laugh was demoniac. "Sir?" said a tentative and servile voice to her left. The Zycon turned, frowning at the interruption. "Well?" The cargo of the 834 contained no mechalite. "None!" Her captor whirled back to Helva, his eyes blazing. "Where did you squander it?" "At Tania Australis," she replied, At Tania Australis, she replied, purposefully keeping her voice low. "Speak up!" he screamed at her. "I'm using all of the power you've allowed me. That amplifier doesn't produce much." "It's not supposed to," the Zycon said irritably, his eyes restlessly darting around the room. Suddenly, there was his finger obscuring all other objects from her vision. "Tell me, which ship is to deliver mechanite next?" "I don't know." "Speak up!" "I feel that I'm shouting already." "You're not, you're whispering." "Is this better?" "Well, I can hear you. Now tell me, which ship is next to deliver the mechanite?" "I don't know." "Will you don't know in darkness?" His laugh and it echoed hollowly in her skull as he plunged her back into nothingness. She forced herself to count, slowly, second speed, so that she had some reference to time. He did not keep her out very long. She wanted to scream simply to fill her mind with sound, yet she managed to keep her voice very low.
No one buttons inside that. Inside the apartment. We're going to have a screen door, and you can
Look out the window and you can enjoy the breeze, but no. No, you do not do the borking. You are adorable, yes, but you do not do the borking. He did not keep her out very long. She wanted to scream Sorry. "Isn't it any better?" he demanded, scowling suspiciously. "Took that Foro obscenity off completely." Helva steeled herself against the compassion she felt. She comforted herself with the knowledge that Foro had already been mindless. "For speech it is sufficient," she said, raising her volume just slightly. She could not use that ploy again, for it would cost Merle or Tagi or Delia what fragile grip they had on their sanity. "Well now, see that it does." He disappeared. Helva heightened her listening volume. She could hear at least 10 different movement patterns beyond her extremely limited vision. From the reverberations of sound, they were in some large but low-ceilinged natural rock cavern. Now, if the main communications panel, part of which was visible to her, was a standard planetary model, if there were not too many chambers beyond this one to diffuse the sound, and if all the Madman's personnel were nearby, she might just be able to do something. He wanted her to sing, did he? She waited, and she kept calm. Presently he returned, absently rubbing his shoulder. Helva increased magnification and noticed the traces of subcutaneous blue. He used tucanite then. A chair was produced from somewhere for him, and he settled himself. Another disembodied hand provided a table on which a dish of choice foods was set. "Sing, my pretty obscenity, sing!" the mad Zycon commanded, reaching languorously over his head toward her input leads. Helva complied. She began in the middle of her range, using the most sensuous songs she could remember, augmenting them subtly but in bass reflex, but keeping the volume tantalizingly low, so he had to crouch forward to hear her. It got on his nerves, and when he peevishly reached out to snatch all but her leads on the board, she begged him not to deprive her peers of sense. "Surely, sir, you could not, when all you need to do is augment my power just slightly from the main board. Even without their very minute power draw on this amplifier, I could not possibly reticulate a croon, for instance." He sat up straight, his eyes flashing with anticipation. "You can reticulate the mating croons?" "Of course," she replied in mild surprise. He frowned at her, torn between a desire to hear those renowned exotic songs and a very real concern to the limit of a shell's ability. He was deep in the thrall of the tucanite now, his senses eager for further stimulation, and the lure of reticulan croons was too much for him. He did, however, call over and consult with a fawning technician who blinked constantly and had a severe tic in one cheek. Fascinated, Helva magnified until she was able to see each muscle fiber jerk. She plunged into dark soundlessness and then, suddenly, felt renewed with a sense of real power against her leads. "You have ample power now, Singer," he told her, his expression vicious with anticipation. "Perform, or you will regret it. And do not try any shell games on me, for I have had them seal off all the other circuits on this amplifier. Sing, shiftless one, sing for your sight and sound." She took an easy one, double voicing it, treble and counter, testing how much power she could get. It would be enough, and the echo of her lilting croon came back bouncingly to reassure her that this installation was not large and was set in natural stone caverns. Very good. She cut in the overtones, gradually adding bass frequencies, but subtly so they seemed just part of the reticulan croon at first. Even with his heightened sensibilities, he wouldn't realize what she was doing. She augmented the inaudible frequencies. Her croon was of particularly compelling variation, and she heard under her singing, if one would permit reticulan croons had such dignified title, the stealthy advance of his slaves and co-workers, lured close by the irresistible siren sounds. She gathered herself and then pumped pure sonic hell into the triple note. It got him first, heightened as he was by the Tucanite. It got him dead, his brains irretrievably scrambled from the massive dose of sonic fury. It got the others in the cavern too. She could hear their shrieks of despair of the weird composite sound she had created as they fainted. The overload short-circuited several panels in the masterboard, showering the unconscious and dead with blinding sparks. Helva threw in what speakers she could keep her now reduced circuit open. To keep her now reduced circuit open. Even she felt the backlash of that supersonic blast. Her nerve ends tingled, her ears rang, and she felt extremely enervated. I'll bet I've developed a very acid condition in my nutrients, she told herself with graveyard humor. The great room was silent except for hoarse breathing and hissing wires. "Delia, answer me. It's Helva." "Who is Helva? I have no access to memory banks." "Tuggy, can you hear me?" "Yes." A flat, mechanical affirmative. "Merle, can you hear me?" "You're loud." Helva stared straight ahead at the dead body that had tortured them so cruelly. Oh, for a pair of hands. Revenge on an inert husk was illogical. Now what do I do, she wondered. At that point she remembered that she had been about to divorce Terron, and the tight beam had been left open. Paralon wasn't the kind to sit on his hands. Where was he? "There you are, Helva, back at the old stand," the ST-1 captain said, patting her column paternally. She scanned to make certain the release plate was locked back into seamless congruity with the rest of the column. "Your new cadence syllable release has been tuned into the metal, and Chief Rayleigh is the only one who knows it," the captain reassured her. "And the independent audio and visual relays are attached to my spare synapses on my shell." "Good idea, that. May make it a standard procedure." "But mine are hooked up." "Yes, yours are hooked up. Seems like a case of asking for clearance when the ship was blasted off. This precaution was after the fact, but have you ever been sense-deprived, Captain?" He shuddered and his eyes darkened. None of the fleet, nor brain-brawn ship personnel who penetrated the Zykon's asteroid headquarters would likely forget the pitiable condition of the Shell people, the amplified human beings who had once been considered invulnerable. "Taggy, Merle, and Delia will recover. Delia will be back in service in a year or so," the captain said quietly. Then he sighed, for he too couldn't bring himself to name Foro. "You people are needed, you know." He leaned forward so suddenly towards her panel that Helva gasped. Easy, Helva." And he slid his hand down the column. "Nope. I can't even feel a seam. You're secure." He carefully gathered up the delicate instruments of his profession, wrapping them in the soft surgical foam. "How are the Brahms?" she asked idly, She stretched out along her rewired extensions, shrugging into her shipskin. Well, Delia's Rife will pull out of the Menkalite addiction. He'd had only one dose. They've still to track down the other 2 ships, but I expect all of the Bronze will survive. His expression altered abruptly, as if he had caught an unpleasant smell. Why did you have your tight beam channel open, Helva? When we got that Brawn of yours out of his padded cell, he was furious that you could disregard proper procedure in such a fashion. The captain managed to... When we got that Brawn of yours out of his padded cell, he was furious that you could disregard proper procedure in such a fashion. The captain managed to sound like Terran for a moment. Why, if you hadn't, and CENTCOM hadn't heard the whole damn thing, how come you'd left the channel open? I'd rather not say, but since you've met Terran, you might be guessing. Well, for whatever reason, it saved your life. It took him long enough. The captain laughed at her sour complaint. Don't forget, you'd been cleared, so your kidnappers just lifted off of Durrell before your supervisor could stop them. But Paralon sure scorched the ears of every operator in frequency range of getting fleet ships after you. And that, with a whole sector to comb, and the drug runners using this asteroid off Borealis as a hideout, too close to Durrell to even a probability, it took a little time. That Zycon thing was a smart mad, hiding right out in sight. Well, he had a high intelligence factor, the captain admitted. After all, he'd made it into Brawn training 20-odd years ago. That had been an unnerving development, Helva reflected. If he'd actually qualified and then developed neural maladjustments. He'd had taken enough Tucanite to break his deconditioning mind blocks, another matter that was going to have to be re-evaluated by Central Worlds as a result of this incident, and had managed to insinuate himself into maintenance crews on Regulus Base, laying the groundwork for his operation by judicious use of addictive drugs on key employees. Then, using CENTCOM Worlds brain ships with drugged Bronze under his control, he could have landed anywhere, including Regulus Base. I'll be off now, the captain said, saluting her respectfully. Let your Brawn take over now. Not if I can help it, Helva replied. Whatever bond of loyalty she'd once had for Terran had dissolved as surely as she had been parted from her security. Terran, having decided that he was hopelessly incarcerated, had stolidly composed himself to await the worst with calm dignity, as any logical man would do. On anyone else's tapes, including the captain's, to judge by the expression on his face, such logic was cowardice, and that was Helva's unalterable conclusion, although she would grant that his behavior had certainly been consistent. Delia's Rife, on the other hand, had tried to break out. He had clawed a foothold in the padded fabric of his cell, lacerating hands and feet in an attempt to reach the ceiling access hatch. Dizzy from a Menkalite injection, confused and weak from starvation intended to allow the Menkalite to work unhindered in his system, he had actually crawled as far as the airlock when the rescue group had arrived. Helva let the Sierra Tango 1 down the ST-1 down the personnel lift, and ran a thorough but hasty flip check on herself. Scanners, sensor meters, power pile, drive chamber, inventory. It was like revisiting a forgotten treasury of minor miracles. Helva wondered if she had ever before appreciated the versatility incorporated by her ship body, or had ever really valued the power that she had at her disposal, or even cherished the ingenuity of her engineers. Oh, it was good to be back together again. Helva, a low voice spoke tentatively. Are you alone now? Sorry. Helva, a low voice spoke tentatively. Are you alone now? It was Central Worlds on the tight beam. Yes, the ST-1 has just left. You can probably reach him. Oh, shove him! And then Helva realized that the hoarse voice must belong to Niall Paralon. I just wanted to know that you were back where you belong. You're sure you're all right, Helva? Niall Paralon, laryngitic with concern? Helva was flattered and surprised, considering his uncomplimentary description hurled at her with their last parting. "I'm intact again, if that's what you mean, Paralon," she replied in droll good humor. She could have sworn she heard a sigh over the tight beam. "Ah, that's my girl," Paralon sighed. So it must have been a wheeze she'd heard. "Of course," and he cleared his throat, "if you hadn't had your synapses scrambled on Beta Corvi, you'd have listened to me when I tried to tell you that simple simming actionite was a regulation brown brass." "Not brass," Niles said. Helva interrupted sharply. "Not brass. Brass is a metal, and Terran has none." "Oh, so you admit I was right about him?" "'Tis human to err." "Thank God!" Just then, Terran requested permission to board. "I'll see you later, Helva. I couldn't stomach—" Don't go, Paralon." "Helva, my one own true love. I've been glued to this tight beam for 3 days for your sake, and the stimutabs have worn off. I'm dead in the seat." "Prop your eyelids open for a few moments more, Niall. This'll be official," she told Paralon as she activated the personnel lift for Terran. She felt a cold dislike replace the bantering friendliness she'd been enjoying. Big as life and disgustingly Neanderthal, her brawn strode into the main control room, saluting with scant ceremony towards her bulkhead. Strode? He swaggered, Helva thought angrily, looking not the least bit worse for his absence. Terran rubbed his hands together, sat himself down in the pilot's chair, flexed his fingers before he poised them, very businesslike, over the computer keyboard. "I'll just run through a thorough check-down to be sure no damage was done." His words were neither request nor order. "Just like that, huh?" Helva asked in a dangerously quiet voice. Terran frowned and swiveled around in the chair towards her panel. "Our schedule has been interrupted enough with this mishap." "Mishap?" "Modulate your tone, Helva. You can't expect to use those tricks on me." "I can't expect what?" "Now," he began placatingly, jerking his chin down, "I take into consideration that you've been under a strain recently. You should have insisted that I oversee the ST-1 captain during that installation. You might have sustained some circuit damage, you know." "How kind of you to consider that possibility," she said. "That was it. You could scarcely be harmed, physically, contained as you are in pure titanium," he said, and swung back to the console. "Terran of Action, all I can say at this point is that it's a damned good thing for you that I'm completely contained behind pure titanium, because if I were mobile, I would kick you down that shaft so fast. What has possessed you?" For once, the sheer blank, illogical amazement flashed across Terran's face. "Get out! Get off my deck! Get out of my sight! Get out!" Helva roared, pouring on volume with each word, with no regard to the tender structure of the human ear. With sheer sound she drove him, hands clapped to the sides of his head, off the deck, down the side of the 834 as fast as he could escalate the lift. "Take me for granted, will you? Unreliable organism am I? Illogical, irresponsible, and inhuman!" Helva bellowed after him in a planet-sized shout, and then she burst out laughing as she realized that such emotional behavior on her part was the only way she could have routed the overlogical Terran of Action. "Did you hear that, Niall Paralon?" she asked in her reasonable but nevertheless exultant tone. "Niall? Hey, CENTCOM, you on the tight beam. Answer me?" From the open channel came the shuddering discord of a massive adenoidal snore. "Niall?" The sleeper wheezed on, oblivious, until Helva chuckled at this additional evidence of human frailty. She asked and received clearance from the asteroid's half-ruined spaceport. She was going to have a long chat with Chief Rayleigh when she returned. Her penalty for divorcing Terran would be a speck against the finder's fee for 4 Shanghai BB ships, and there ought to be a Federation bonus for aid in the apprehension of drug runners. Totaled, if true justice was giving her half a chance, the rewards might just make her a free ship, out of debt, and truly her own mistress. The thought was enough to set her singing. So, with that, we're on page 199. which means that we have 49 pages to go. So that is probably going to be one more night's read, and I have to re-record the first chapter, obviously, because that just was not acceptable quality control. I'm sorry, I have failed you. But anyway, it is past my bedtime, and it's probably coming up on yours. So, get some rest, do your best, and remember, if people can hate without knowing anything about you, then I can love for exactly the same reason. So take good care of yourself, okay?